Hello and welcome to Press TV's Debate. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, although in 2015 representatives from 6 nations signed an agreement dealing with Iran's nuclear program, it almost appears that there are some which want to start all over again with negotiations. Iran says it will not renegotiate the agreement and that the U.S. must rejoin the JCPOA and remove all sanctions immediately and all at once, and this be verified before Tehran remove its remedial measures. Washington says it will not remove all sanctions at once. Well, this is the backdrop to continued talks between the JCPOA signatories, with the U.S. also in attendance in Vienna.
Iran and the remaining signatories to the 2015 nuclear deal are preparing to hold fresh talks aimed at reviving the accord in the wake of Washington's unilateral pullout in 2018. The parties ended their last and 5th round of such talks in the Austrian capital, Vienna, on Tuesday. A U.S. delegation was present in the city, but Iran rejected any discussions with it. Ahead of the upcoming negotiations, Iran's lead negotiator and deputy foreign minister warned that Tehran will not allow the talks to become attritional. Abbas Araghchi also said Iran would stop the negotiations if it detects that the other side lacks seriousness, tries to buy time, or seeks to add new issues to those under discussion. Iran has time and again stressed that the deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, can only be salvaged if the country's demands are met.
Iran says the United States must verifiably remove all sanctions that it has imposed, reimposed, and relabeled against the Islamic Republic over the past years. Tehran also stresses that it will not accept the gradual or sequential removal of the sanctions, saying they must be removed all at once. Iran says it will return to compliance with the JCPOA only after it verifies that all sanctions have been removed in practice, not on paper.
Iran's leader has previously said those demands are the country's definitive policy. Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei has also said the main problem between Iran and the US is that Tehran cannot trust Washington. Iran began to reduce its commitments under the JCPOA a year after former US President Donald Trump abandoned the deal in May 2018. Earlier this month, Iran also began enriching uranium to 60% purity. All what has been taken is in response to the failure of the remaining signatories to compensate for the US withdrawal. That's what Iran says, stressing that the remedial measures are reversible only after the US fulfills its JCPOA obligations. Iran says its stance on the ongoing talks over the nuclear deal is clear. Now, it seems that it's up to the Biden administration on whether to use the Vienna talks as an opportunity to comply with the JCPOA or continue the maximum pressure campaign launched by its predecessor, a campaign that many White House officials have already described as a failed policy.
Well, I'd like to welcome my guests to this debate. Out of New York, John Bosnitch, a political analyst. Out of Tehran, Fuad Ezadi, professor of world studies from the University of Tehran. Nice to have both of you. We're going to start this off in New York with John. Now, it was the U.S. which left the JCPOA, and now Iran is demanding that it returns to the agreement and abide by all of its commitments and remove all sanctions against Tehran first. Do you see this as a reasonable demand on Tehran's part?
Well, obviously, this is the correct starting point for the Iranian position, because it was no fault of Iran's that the sanctions were imposed. And it was an attempt by the U.S. State Department, through the president, to impose additional new conditions and pressures on Iran. So I know that this program is called the Debate program, but I couldn't agree with your side more, because there is such a thing as international law, and there are such things as treaties and agreements between states, and those are the most sacrosanct agreements that nations can make. You cannot unilaterally violate them unless you're planning war, and that may have been what they were planning. But now, with any luck, We've avoided these crises, and America has to start playing straight and stop lying, period.
What do you think about that, Fuad? You heard our guest in New York that America now has to start playing straight and stop lying, because Iran has demanded that all sanctions be removed from Tehran all at once and then be verified by Iran that the sanctions really have been removed before Tehran reverses remedial actions. Your take on that, and as our other guest said, do you think that America will start playing straight?
Well, if you listen to U.S. Government officials, the answer to that question is no. You can go to the U.S. State Department website. After the American delegation returned to Washington a couple of days ago, 3-4 days ago, Rob Malley, who is U.S.'s special envoy on Iran, had a discussion with American reporters. They didn't put his name. They just called him a senior State Department official. But based on what we know, it was Rob Malley that was talking. And he was saying that he is not going to, and the United States is not going to lift sanctions. They like some of Trump's sanctions. They like some of Obama's sanctions. They like some of the sanctions that were relabeled by the Trump administration. There's this addiction to sanctions, and whether you're a Republican or a Biden Democrat, you seem to like these sanctions. It's difficult to get rid of that addiction. He was saying that they don't accept this idea of Iran verifying the idea that the sanctions were actually removed. And the third point that was interesting for me, he said that the next U.S. administration may not accept whatever agreement the Biden administration is going to have with Iran. And we have an experience on that with the Trump administration that just left the nuclear agreement. So when you put these three things together, you have no other choice but to give a negative answer to the question that you asked.
Your take, John. You heard.
Well, I agree.
Yeah, you heard what Fuad said. I mean, so is it a diplomatic ploy by the United States? As Fuad said, State Department made these statements a few days ago. What is it exactly? Do they want to return? They don't want to return? Or what? On the one hand, Iran has said that they must drop all sanctions. They must cancel, remove all sanctions. On that side, the U.S. is saying, well, the State Department spokesman said that it would not do that. And on the other hand, it's saying that perhaps another administration would not be loyal to an agreement. So tell me, your perspective, what is going on here?
I have to understand where your laughter comes from, because it is like the theater of the absurd. It's not like you're dealing with the government. It's like you're dealing with a gang of two-bit criminals who say to you, we'll sign a contract with you, but we can't guarantee that it will be abided by. But when you enter into that contract, you have to do everything on your side, but we'll do nothing on our side. And at the end of all of that, you have to let us come over there and inspect whether you've done everything that you should do on your side while we do nothing on our side. And then at the end of that, you should say you're happy and thankful. It's almost like it's like a parody of political interaction. And I think that Iran's people and the Iranian government know full well who they're dealing with. And I think they have to be on their guard. And I think they have to continue to tighten their relations with other superpowers like China, like Russia, like India, and build together for a multilateral, balanced, non-polarized world. Because so long as we allow one power to dictate illegally to anybody around the world, this world will never see peace. Never. And I think that Iran is really in a position here to set an example for the whole world, because Iran is completely within its rights It is completely within international law. And having worked with governments in Japan, in Canada, and in Europe, I can tell you that they all know that Iran is right here. And so you may help to liberate some of these American colonies from their masters.
What do you think about that, Fuad? What John said, they all know that Iran is in the right, and perhaps they will change. Does it make a difference? John was talking about international law. Now, these entities that have been part of this JCPOA, one would think that they would know international law and know that the United States was in violation of international law prior to leaving the JCPOA, and even since that time with more and more illegal sanctions being implemented against Tehran. Does it make a difference? Do you think that it can make a difference with these other countries that Iran has abided by its side of the agreement every step of the way?
Well, the Biden administration is in continuation of violating international law. The United States is a member of the Security Council, a permanent member of the Security Council. Following UN resolutions is international law, and the Trump administration obviously violated international law when Trump left the nuclear agreement. Biden has been in office for about 3 months, and he continues to follow that same policy. And we have people sitting in the White House that are not allowing Iran to use its own money to pay for COVID vaccines, resulting in people getting killed. And they talk about human rights. And they sanction Iran for violation of human rights. So the people in the White House are not normal. They engage in these type of illegal activities, and more than just violating international law, they violate basic human rights principles. That when you have a pandemic, sanctioning the country and not allowing it to use its own money to pay for vaccines or pay for other things that countries generally need to have to fight the pandemic is a war crime. So they engage in an economic war, and they engage in criminal activities while they're imposing this economic war on Iran. So that's what you have in the Biden administration.
Well, John, Iran's top negotiator at the Vienna talks, Abbas Araghchi, says Iran will not let the talks take too long or get off track. No other demands outside the original agreement will be discussed. Your take on that? Do you think that that can happen, or he will be able to direct the situation to that?
I think that we've agreed now on the principle that Iran's position is legal and is correct in terms of international law as well. And now we have to start into what they call realpolitik, which means the reality of politics. And the reality of politics is much dirtier than the law. The United States is effectively not the world's policeman, but the world's bully. And as a bully, it tends to flex its muscles. Now, although Trump was a very, very loud-mouthed president of the United States, one can give him the credit for being the first president since World War II not to start a war. And so Trump probably took direction from the people who support him to put sanctions on. Biden is a totally different creature. Biden is what we would call a warmonger. There's never been a war that Biden didn't support. So I am concerned that Biden, in his what's evidently entering senility, might come under the influence of the State Department, which is actually just the Department of War. And I think that Iran has to play realpolitik. Iran has to count on its allies to ensure its protection. And Iran has to prepare for every kind of pressure that could come from the United States. And that is the full range of activity, including so-called punitive rocket strikes and so on. And I deeply regret to say that that's the way this world works, but I believe that Iran is a strong country, and I believe that the people of Iran have had enough experience with America that they know that the only possible course of action is to stand firm. That's the only way to go. And in that way, Iran will show America that you cannot get away with some kind of illegal activity when you're dealing with Iran. And I do believe that Iran has to stay strong on this. When I was working with the Japanese government, there were several instances when we had to tell America no, N-O, and America backed down. There is a precedent.
Okay, well, Fuad, your take on that. Do you think Tehran's role right now is to play realpolitik, as John has said, or the direction you think that Tehran should be taking?
You know, Iran has figured out what the United States is all about. We have had the difficulties with the United States dating back to the 1953 coup, before we had anything called the Islamic Republic. So this type of hostility towards Iranian people has been around for decades, and people realize that it's not going to go away. It doesn't make a difference whether you have a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. And since we have this history of confrontation by the United States, I think more and more people realize that the only way out is this culture of resistance, because there is no other choice for the Iranian people to be able to defend themselves. And there are ways that Iran can use its own leverages towards the other side. Iran's nuclear development is extensive. No matter how much the Israelis try to sabotage this program, Iran's knowledge on peaceful nuclear development is very deep. And as you have seen, the Iranian government has taken steps in the last few weeks to actually increase Iran's activities in this area. Iran has said that the country is not interested in a nuclear bomb. Iran is a member of NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, and since Iran is a member, using nuclear technology for peaceful purposes is a right that you have. Enriching uranium as a member of NPT is a right that countries have. So exercising that right is going to be leverage. So the more pressure you get from the United States and countries like Israel, there is no other choice but to push back. And I think that's what the country has decided to do. Iran's parliament, as you know, passed a law that required the executive branch to actually increase Iran's activities in this area. And that's going to apply. They extended, there was an agreement between Iran and International Atomic Energy Agency that's nearing an end. And I don't think Iranian government will extend that deadline because we don't see much progress in Vienna talks. And, when we read American media, Israeli media, we see the true purpose of the U.S. government coming to these talks. For example,
20 seconds.
Times of Israel, this article that talking to a Biden administration official saying that we want to create a front against Iran, but by coming to these talks. So there is no decision on the American government to change its policies towards Iran.
And on that note, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I appreciate both of you being with us. John Bosnitch, political analyst out of New York, and Fuad Ezzadi out of Tehran, professor of world studies, University of Tehran. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Hope to see you right here next time.